channel, and today we will discuss the situation in the world on the 21st of June of 2026. Today we have lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about the conflict on the territory of Ukraine, where during the previous 24 hours we received lots of very interesting updates and details, and we have two of the most important updates. The first one is that the Ukrainians during the previous 24 hours attacked the territory around the city of Kerch. And as you can see, according to this picture, according to these satellite images, we have lots of fire anomalies. The Ukrainians attacked port infrastructure, the Ukrainians attacked the military base and air defense position, and many more objects of critical infrastructure of Russians through this territory. Another important thing is that for the first time since the beginning of the special military operation, the Russians attacked bridges along the river of Dnipro in the area of the city of Zaporozhye. And we see that the conflict between Russia and Ukraine intensifies, and most likely in coming days we'll see lots of interesting updates on this matter. So let's discuss everything in details, and first let's talk about the territory around the settlement of Kerch. So this is the city I'm talking about, and this is the object that was destroyed, that was attacked first and then destroyed by the Ukrainians. We have lots of videos on this matter. In these videos, we can see the consequences of attack. Most likely another oil tank was damaged or destroyed, or several oil tanks were damaged and destroyed by the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians, as usually, were using different types of drones to attack this territory. The Russians, according to information we have, were trying to bring down all these drones. They were using lots of air defense systems. But as we can see, as a result of attack, the Russians lost several oil tanks, and which means that this situation worsened the oil crisis that is currently taking place through Crimea. Here we have videos of how exactly the Ukrainians were attacking this territory. In this video, we can see a Ukrainian drone that was flying towards the city of Kerch and towards the objects of infrastructure, of different types of infrastructure in this area. Here we have an explosion. Here we have another Ukrainian drone that was flying in the same direction, but as for this drone, the Russians managed to bring this drone down. So once again, we see that from one side, the Russians have capabilities to destroy Ukraine's drones and to bring them down, but at the same time we see that it seems that the Ukrainians launched too many of drones, and basically the Russians are not able to destroy every single one. Another important thing that since the beginning of June we have already talked about the situation in this area, and it was just a matter of time when the Ukrainians would attack this theater with hundreds of drones, because first of all this is not just the only way how the Russians can bring fuel on the territory of Crimea. Furthermore, this is the only option, the only area for business and for commercials to bring fuel on the territory of Crimea. And this video, for example, was published on the 2nd of June of 2026, and here we can see hundreds probably of fuel trucks concentrated around the settlement of Kerch or in the area of this Taman Bay. And obviously, when talking about this video on the 2nd of June, it was clear that that was just a matter of time when the Ukrainians would carry out a massive attack in this area. But the question is why the Ukrainians attacked this territory just today. And the answer to this question is very simple. During the previous days, the most important thing that the Ukrainians were trying to achieve, they were trying to destroy the logistics of the northern Crimea. During the previous days, we received lots of videos how Ukrainians were attacking bridges in the northern parts of Crimea, and when the Ukrainians finished this operation, and when the Ukrainians managed to create the situation when it was very dangerous for business and for commercials to use this territory for the fuel supply purposes, the Russians, more precisely business and different companies, began using this territory for these purposes, which means that these days there were not just hundreds of fuel trucks and just regular trucks, there were thousands of them in this area. And when the Ukrainians realized that this is the moment, this is the best moment to attack, the Ukrainians attack. And most likely the Ukrainians in coming days, in coming hours, in coming nights will continue this process, and they will attack even more. The question is what the Ukrainians are trying to achieve with all these attacks, and this is also a very simple situation. The thing is that there is a Crimea bridge in this area, but the problem is that the Russian authorities doesn't allow the Russians to use the Crimean bridge, this territory, for the fuel logistic purposes. It is not allowed because the Russians understand that if fuel trucks began using this, let's say, road, the Ukrainians would attack them, and if it happens, of course, there would be much higher risks of the situation that the Crimean bridge would be destroyed or damaged significantly. So that's why the Russians don't allow to use this bridge for fuel supply purposes, and this is exactly what the Ukrainians are trying to achieve. They try to establish complete control over the northern Crimea. They try to establish complete control over additional roads, how the Russians are able to get the Crimea itself. And when it happens, the Russians sooner or later, according to the logic of the Ukrainian side, would be forced to start using the Crimean bridge for fuel purposes, for fuel supply purposes. And imagine yourself hundreds of fuel trucks moving along the Crimean bridge under the attack of the Ukrainian drones. Obviously, this can lead to the situation where the Crimean bridge, would be damaged significantly. And but from the other side, the Russians understand the situation, so that is why they began reinforcing their positions and their logistics through the northern parts of Crimea, and we start receiving the first fresh satellite pictures where we can see additional bridges that were created by Russians in the area of the settlement of Armyansk, Genichesk, and of course the settlement of by the name of Chongar. And the Russians, as you can see, tried to build not pontoon bridges, but bridges with sand, which means that if you build such a bridge, it is impossible to destroy this bridge neither with drone or with missile, because the Russians would be able to repair this bridge very fast. And now, according to different sources, the Russians are trying to build dozens of bridges through the northern parts of Crimea. And of course, as of now, we can say that the time works in the Russian favor, because the Ukrainians need the Russians to allow the use of Crimean bridge right now, but the Russians are not doing this. But at the same time, the Russians are building bridges. So of course, let's wait and see how these things are going to develop. But at the same time, we see that the Russians are mirroring this situation, and the Russians, according to operations they have carried out since the beginning of June, probably managed to cut the most southwestern parts of the Odessa region from the mainland. So the Ukrainians were trying to create Crimea as a Crimean island, but now we see that the Russians managed to do the same thing, but with the southwestern parts of Odessa. As of now, it is very difficult to imagine how the Ukrainians are able to move cargo from the south, between the southwestern parts of Odessa region with the mainland, because these territories under complete Russian fire control. These days we receive almost every single day a video of how Russians were attacking the logistic through this territory, how the Russians were destroying the gas stations in this area and fuel trucks. So this is the situation. Another important thing, of course, is the city of Zaporozhye, because as we discussed during the previous video, for the first time since the beginning of the special military operation, the Russians used at least 12 bombs to attack the city of Zaporozhye, just with one purpose: not to destroy the logistics, not to destroy some warehouse or ammo depot, not to destroy a military base. The Russians were tasked to destroy or to damage bridges along the river of Dnipro. As of the end of the 21st of June of 2026, we can make a conclusion that the Russians haven't managed to destroy bridges. First of all, and the most important thing, the Russians decided not to attack the bridges along the river. And probably the Russians came to this conclusion not to attack the bridges along the river because it's very difficult to hit this target. The bridges are not very small, and if you miss the target within 6 meters, this means that you will miss the target at all. So that is why the Russians decided to attack not the bridges along the river itself, but to bomb infrastructure and the beginnings of all these bridges on the surface. So because if Russians, for example, with bombs damaged these bridges and these constructions, of course, even from this perspective, the Ukrainians would lose possibilities to use these bridges as well. So this is the first thing that the Russians decided to do. Once again, the Russians used 12 bombs to attack the city of Zaporozhye and the bridge infrastructure. As a result, we don't know for sure whether the Russians managed to damage these bridges at all, but the local sources stated that the police officers of the Zaporozhye region report that traffic on the Preobrazhensky bridge is blocked but is open through the Dnipro gas. So which means that as a result of this attack, the Russians managed to stop traffic, or at least to stop the logistic at least partially through this territory, but not completely. But this is just the first day of these attacks. Most likely the Russians will continue, and most likely the Russians will also begin bombing the bridges, at least through the city of Zaporozhye, not just with bombs, but also with missiles and drones. As of now, the Russians currently don't have capabilities to attack Dnipro bridges, but as of the current situation, they don't need this. The Russians, if they destroy the Zaporozhye bridges, then most likely the logistics of the city of Orekhov, Yurkovka, the eastern Zaporozhye direction would collapse completely without any chances for the Ukrainians to restore these logistics. And if it happens, most likely the front line in this area will collapse automatically. Maybe not automatically, but will collapse much faster than expected, and the Russians would be able to break through Ukraine's defense, to bridge Ukraine's defense, and to get the city of Zaporozhye from the southeast and from the east. So the major battle of the city of Zaporozhye intensifies. But as of the previous 24 hours, another important update is coming from the most northwestern parts of the settlement. Today was a video published that the Russians destroyed another gas station in this area, and this gas station was completely destroyed through the city of Zaporozhye. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation on the ground in this area. During the previous 12 hours, we received additional changes between the cities of Slaviansk and Konstantinovka. We see that the Russian offensive operation reduced or dropped significantly through this weekend. The Russians improved their positions in the northern parts of the city of Konstantinovka, and these are the changes on the ground, just small progress in the area of the Chervony micro district. And according to these updates, we see that the Russians also began improving their positions between the settlements of Konstantinovka and Chasov Yar. It seems that from this configuration, the front line, the Russians decided to maintain the lines and to establish complete control over these pockets between the cities of Konstantinovka and Chasov Yar. And if it happens, the Russians will be able to maintain logistics, to maintain their positions, and from this line, the Russians would continue offensive operation further in the direction of the settlement of Alexeyev-Kudryshkovka through the northeastern and the eastern parts. So the Russians would repeat their tactics they had during the Battle of Konstantinovka. They would do the same. They will attack the city of Alexeyev-Kudryshkovka from the east, and they would attack the settlement from the west and from the southwest. So the Battle of Alexeyev-Kudryshkovka hasn't been started yet, but most likely in coming days this will happen. Another important thing is the northeastern Slaviansk direction. During the previous 24 hours, we had changes from the ground in the area of the settlement of Kriva Luka, and these are the changes between the dates. The Russians began advancing further in the western direction, trying to take under complete control the forest in this area. On the way towards the settlement of Nikolaevka, we see that the Russians approaching the settlement of Nikolaevka from at least several directions, from the south and from the eastern. And in coming days, we might start receiving first updates on this matter. Another important thing about the city of Konstantinovka, a very important detail. Today, several pro-Ukrainian sources stated that first sabotage and reconnaissance groups of the armed forces of the Russian Federation were recorded through the southern parts of the settlement of Vosivkovo. So today, during the 21st of June of 2026, we received the first report that the Russians answered the settlement of Vosivkovka, which means that the situation here is quite critical for the Ukrainians, and the situation is not going to be stabilized, at least from the Ukrainian side. Furthermore, the Russians continue their offensive operation through the city of Liman. During the previous day, we haven't received anything about changes on the ground. We have just a report published by the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation. According to this report, the Russians managed to improve their positions through the cities. A few more dozens of buildings were captured by Russians, and the Ukrainians were forced to fall back from this area. Now let's move to the northern directions. We have lots of interesting updates. The Russians continue attacking the logistic line between the western bank of the river of Dnipro and the city of Kharkiv. We're talking about the settlement of Poltava and the city of Kharkiv itself. As for the settlement of Poltava, during the previous 24 hours, lots of videos were published where we can see the consequences of the Russian attack. Lots of buildings and parking sites were destroyed. Probably several gas stations were destroyed as well. Furthermore, we have reports about several logistic hubs and industrial zones that were destroyed by Russians. And the city of Kharkiv, we have a report that the Russians destroyed another logistic hub, which is located between the cities of Kharkiv and Sumy. And as of the northern direction, according to different sources, the Russians have already destroyed every single gas station through the city of, through the Sumy region itself. And now the Russians are shifting their focus in the direction of the city of Kharkiv and the Kharkiv region. The Russians are tasked to destroy every single gas station through this area, which, according to the Russian understanding of the situation, will allow the Russians to improve their positions significantly during the summer military campaign. The Russians reported that they continue their offensive operation through the settlement of Kazachya Lopen. Different sources stated that Russians control up to 35% of the village and the Russians continue advancing. As for the northeastern direction, the Russians continue offensive operation in the direction of the settlement of Bely Kolodys, and these are the changes on the ground in this area between the 18th and the 21st of June of 2026. The Russians are moving in the direction of Bely Kolodys using the broad front line attack. The Russians attack this area from the west, from the northwest, and from the north. The Russians continue battle for the most northeastern parts of Kharkiv region. In coming days, we might receive additional changes and additional reports about the situation between the villages of Shabelny, Nisterna, Nikolaevka, Varvarovka, and Malovochya. The Russians are trying to force the Ukrainians to fall back from this territory in the southern direction towards the settlement of Maly-Burluk. So the situation remains tense in this area. The Russians continue advancing, and as of now, the Ukrainians cannot stabilize the situation, but they try to bring as many as possible reserves with the purpose to do this. As for the Zaporozhye direction, as we discussed, the Russians right now are tasked to destroy bridges. Meanwhile, the Russians intensify their attacks on the main logistic hubs, main logistic lines, with the purpose not to allow the Ukrainians to bring additional forces to the line of combat contact. But as you can see, during the 20th and during the 21st of June of 2026, we didn't receive almost anything on the matter of changes on the ground. Both the Russians and the Ukrainians right now prefer to use drones to attack deep inside of the territory of each other. According to the Minister of Defense of Ukraine, the Russians during the previous day used 109 drones, which means that during the previous 3 days, when the Russians were using a minimal number of drones to attack the territory of Ukraine, managed to accumulate up to 500 drones, which means that probably even between the 21st and the 22nd of June of 2026, so during the upcoming night, the Russians would carry out a massive attack through the entire territory of Ukraine. Because not just the accumulation of drones signals about the situation. Furthermore, during the day, we received lots of updates about Russian drones activities over the territory of Ukraine. As you can see, we have lots of pictures about possible positions of Russian drones over the territory of Ukraine. And according to this reconnaissance operation, we see that the Russians were trying to understand what is happening mainly in the area of the cities of Zhytomyr, Kiev, Rovno, and Lutsk. So the Russians were conducting a reconnaissance operation of the territory between the border with Poland, the city of Kovel, and the city of Kiev. So which means that probably during the upcoming massive attack, the Russians would try to deal significant damage to this territory, to logistics of this territory, gas stations, warehouses, ammo depots, objects of energy infrastructure, and so on. And of course, the Russians would attack the city of Kiev itself. So the next night is going to be a very important one, because most likely the Ukrainians would attack the theater of Russia as well using hundreds of drones, and then we will understand what is going to happen next. And that's it for today. The military